I'm Jonathan Grazer, rector of Grace Church, and I'd like to welcome you, all of you, to this second lecture in our series on building a more just community. We are, as I said last time, this is partly a response or outgrowth of our congregation's conversations about racism and racial inequities, and trying to think about ways that we can address those issues locally and across the country. And as part of that, we wanted to open it up to the wider community as well and invite folks from the community to come in and engage with us around these issues. Tonight, I'd like to offer a special welcome to the Rev Jerry Hancock, who has been involved for many years in issues around incarceration and prison ministry. He is a lawyer by background and entered the ministry as a second career, and found through work in the prisons a way of connecting with his background. And he's a tenacious advocate for justice. And given the fact that Wisconsin is the worst state in the country in terms of racial disparities and incarceration, this is an issue that is of ought to be of enormous concern to all of us. And Jerry, I turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to Grace Church for inviting me here. I have personal memories of this church that go way back, and many of you from Grace Church, I'm sure, know the Chatterton family, Bill and Grace, and Bill was my first boss, so like I say, my fondness for Grace Church is really deep. Also, I'm sort of honored and intimidated by following Brian Stevenson, who was here on Monday night. And I do want to talk about how the issues that he raised in Just Mercy, how those issues sort of play out in Wisconsin. But it is intimidating. I'm also a little intimidated from following my friend David Cooper, who was here 2 weeks ago. David and I were colleagues in the Madison criminal justice system. We've been friends for 40 years, and I'm always happy to follow him, but always a little intimidated. When I decided to leave the law and become a minister, I was literally following Cooper, who left being a cop to become a minister. So when I would go around and explain to people, oh yeah, you're like Cooper, which I took as a compliment. So as Jonathan said, full disclosure requires that I begin by telling you that I used to be a lawyer. And so what I'm doing now is obviously atonement. And I need to tell you maybe just a minute about how I got to be where I am, because I think for many of us it's hard to understand the meaning of our own lives, and it's hard to understand where God wants us to be. I spent 35 years working in the criminal justice system as a lawyer. I was a public defender. I was deputy district attorney here in Dane County when Jim Doyle was the DA. I've prosecuted and defended shoplifters, rapists, and murderers. I wrote legislation. For a while, I was head of the state crime lab, They didn't let me do experiments, but I was in charge of the administration of the crime lab. And during that time, we introduced forensic DNA into Wisconsin. And then for a while, I was head of consumer protection and in the Department of Justice. And we prosecuted Publishers Clearinghouse for defrauding the elderly. It was a great life. And I enjoyed going to work every day. But several years ago, I began to feel that I might be being called in a different direction. And I can pinpoint the immediate source of that call. It wasn't quite like Paul on the road to Damascus. And I suspect that things had been percolating for a while. But there was one moment that I can recall when I said, I need to do something different. And it occurred when a woman named Pam Oliver, who is a sociologist here at the University of Wisconsin, who has spent her whole career studying racial disparity in prisons. And she gave a talk down on campus, and I'm not sure, as with so many things in our lives, when we reach a turning point, I'm not sure why I was there at that lecture. But she said something astounding. She said that by some measures, a young black man in Dane County was 208 times more likely to go to prison than a young white man.
Wow.
That changed my life. Because I had been part of that system, that criminal justice system, for 35 years. I've actually been in leadership positions in that system. I had made policy. I had made decisions about people's lives in that system. And I was stunned by the racism of that number. 208 times. And I thought to myself, how could this be? I know the people in this system. I know the cops. I've known every chief of police in Madison for 40 years. I've known every sheriff. I know all the prosecutors. I knew all the judges. How could people that I knew to be smart, good, well-intentioned people who did not hate African Americans, how could all those people, myself included, produce that kind of result? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it was the racism was systematic. And let me give you the way I began to think about this with a hypothetical. Let's imagine two young men who are 20 years old, one white, living in the dorms on campus. The other, an African-American kid living in South Madison. They both get arrested for selling marijuana. The white kid is selling it in the dorms. The black kid is selling it in South Madison. They both get charged with the same offense, which is selling drugs. They both plead guilty. And they both get the same sentence. So there is no question in this hypothetical about racial profiling. There's no question about who had the better lawyer. The sentence that the judge imposes is that you be on probation for 2 years. The condition of the probation is that you get treatment for your drug use. You either have a full-time job or be in school. and you don't hang around with the people that got you in trouble. Both kids get exactly the same sentence with exactly the same conditions. The white kid gets drug treatment on his father's health insurance. He moves out of the dorm to an apartment on Langwood Street. He stays in school, graduates, and gets on with his life. The young black man can only live with his grandmother, and she's about ready to throw him out because he gets in trouble all the time. He knows no one who has a full-time job. And the only way he can stay in school is to really get back into school is if he rides the bus an hour each way to MATC. His only ability at drug treatment is if he waits 6 months for an appointment at the Dane County Mental Health Center. So he violates his probation and goes to prison. Now, everybody in the system would say those two young men were treated fairly. There was no racism in that case. They were arrested for the same crime. They pled guilty to the same crime. They got the same sentence. There is no racism in that process. And if you were to ask them, if you were to say, how come the black kid goes to prison and the white kid doesn't? They would say, look, I'm just doing my job. I treated those two kids exactly the same way. Don't you dare talk to me about racism. But what that case illustrates is how the system, the criminal justice system, refuses to recognize the vast difference in Dane County between black lives and white lives. And as long as the system refuses to recognize that, we will not get to justice. So that lecture with Pam Oliver motivated me to begin the process of leaving the law and becoming an ordained minister. Brian Stevenson has a great phrase in Just Mercy where he talks about a judge who gave him a bad ruling in one of his cases. And he said, that judge was just being a custodian of the system. And I couldn't be a custodian of the system anymore. So in my denomination, which is the United Church of Christ, to be ordained, you have to get a master's in divinity. And so I started that process while I was still working full-time and had to decide where I would go to seminary, because my denomination, you can go to any accredited seminary, but you have to then do denominational things to get ordained. And so I looked around, and there was a terrific seminary in Dubuque. There was a couple of seminaries in Chicago. One in Chicago was Unitarian, and they were very accommodating to same career people. But I thought if I went there, I would miss Christmas. If I went, there was a seminary, another seminary, Chicago Theological Seminary, which is affiliated with the United Church of Christ. And so it came down to either Dubuque or CTS in Chicago. And in those days, the driving time was about the same. And I thought, well, if I go to Dubuque, I'm in Dubuque. And if I go to Chicago, I'm in Chicago.
Right.
So I ended up at Chicago Theological Seminary after 4 years and 100 trips back and forth to Chicago, reading some very strange books. If you're one of those people on a plane and you don't want to talk to the person next to you, if you take out a book called Theology of Early Church Fathers, Volume 1. Nobody will talk to you. So you might want to get that cover for a book that you read. So after that, and at the age of 53, rediscovering the joys of student loans, I realized where God wanted me to be. And God wants me to be in prison. Because it's in prison where I can find the justice that's missing in the criminal justice system. I was called to prison because in Wisconsin, the prisons operate at least 120% of capacity, which means that men and women share a cell with an open toilet, and sometimes 3 people in a cell, sometimes for 23 hours a day. And I knew that was not God's justice. I know that in Wisconsin, the prison population has increased 300% in the last 20 years. And that is not God's justice. I know that the majority of men and women in Wisconsin prisons are black, brown, or red. And that is not God's justice. I know that the public policy in Wisconsin, known as truth in sentencing, which went into effect in 2000, eliminated parole and time off for good behavior. So every day of your sentence, you're going to spend in prison. There is nothing you can do inside the walls that will affect you getting out of prison. It is not hyperbole to say that if you won the Nobel Peace Prize, you would not get out of prison one day early. And I know that that is not God's justice. So 10 years ago, we started something called the Prison Ministry Project. And it's a ministry of the United Church of Christ. I'm based at First Congregational at Breeze Terrace University. And our mission is to help people inside prison, help their families, help their victims, and to work for prison reform outside the walls. So if my work life is in balance, I spend half my time in prison and the other half at the Capitol working for prison reform. And frankly, the people I meet in prison are much nicer. I said that one time to some guys in prison. One guy said, well, if some of those guys in the Capitol get sent to prison, do they become nicer? I said, oh yeah. So that's what I do, and that's why I do it. And so how do we change this? How do we change this system? And the first thing we have to do is to begin to care about the people in prison. And I think these are hard conversations to have, even in Christian churches. I think many people believe that people in prison are there because they did something terrible, that they knew what they were doing, that they got a just sentence. And therefore, And all our concern should be for their victim. And so therefore they've taken themselves off our list of people we should care about. And there's actually kind of a theological theme to that argument. If you think about the great parable of the Good Samaritan, all of that story is focused on the victim. There's no discussion of the men who beat him and ran away. So we can claim that story and say that's where our concern should be. Jesus tells us that's where our focus should be. But that's a limited view for Christians, because in Matthew, Jesus has this list of things we're supposed to do. We're supposed to feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, clothe the naked, give water to the thirsty, help the sick, and visit people in prison. So if that's on Jesus' list, as Christians, it really ought to be on our list too. We can't weasel out of this by saying, no, we just want to care for the victims. Jesus doesn't allow us to do that. So how do we engage this issue? And the first thing we have to do is to care about those people. And I think there's a story, and John, you should tell me if I get too Christian about all this.
You're not going to have that problem from me.
Well, actually, and the story I want to tell is actually from the Hebrew Bible, so I'm trying to work both sides here. It's the story of Ruth, the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth is it's basically a short story. It's about 4 pages long. And it's the story of a woman named Naomi who lives in Bethlehem with her husband and 2 sons. And things are really hard in Bethlehem. There's a famine. And so the family decides that they're going to move to Moab. Now, Moab is across the Jordan Valley. It's maybe 40 or 50 miles. But culturally, it's a different universe. For Jews to move to Moab was unheard of. The Moabites were the traditional enemies of the Jews. So to make this move, I don't mean to be sacrilegious about this, but to try and capture it, it's as if a family of devoted Packer fans who lived in Green Bay and had 2 sons named Aaron and Roger and were forced to move to Chicago and live in a tent in the middle of Soldier Field. And even worse, the 2 boys marry rich girls from Chicago. So that's the context. But things don't go well for Naomi's family, and her husband and 2 sons die within the first 4 chapters. And so Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law are left alone. And they have to decide what to do. And Naomi decides she's going back to Bethlehem to be with her family. And one of the girls, Orpah, decides to go back to her family in Moab, and presumably a life of comfort and security. But Ruth, the other daughter-in-law, makes an astounding promise. She tells Naomi, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Where you die, I will die. And your people shall be my people. Listen, the people in prison are still our people, and they cannot be forgotten. So, we have to care. Then we have to know. We have to learn. And everybody should read Michelle Alexander's book called The New Jim Crow. It's the most important book that's been written about criminal justice in 40 years. And in that book, well, the reason it's entitled The New Jim Crow is because her thesis is that public policies, particularly the war on drugs and mass incarceration, have been deliberately created to exclude African American men from American society. In the same way that Jim Crow laws, which were American apartheid, I mean, these were legal ways of excluding black people from American society. The reason they're called Jim Crow laws is because Jim Crow in the 1830s was a caricature of a black man, made to look like, a fool. And so to call these Jim Crow laws was to say, well, these are people that are just clowns and fools, so we can exclude them. And those laws stayed in effect and were approved by the United States Supreme Court until 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court said, no, that idea, that euphemism of separately equal is unconstitutional. But Michelle Alexander's thesis is that we've created a new kind of apartheid through the use of drug prosecutions and mass incarceration. And just to make the point, if you put a sign on the city buses in Madison saying that if you have been convicted of a drug offense, you have to ride in the back of the bus, those buses will look very much like the buses in Montgomery, Alabama in 1954. That's what it means to call something the new Jim Crow. These policies of mass incarceration and the war on drugs are not natural disasters. We have created these policies and they can be changed. But they can only be changed if we understand the way they work. Just Mercy is another terrific book. And in Wisconsin, we don't, so far, have the death penalty. So his work with death penalty inmates doesn't really, it's not something we see in Wisconsin. But the other themes in this book, mass incarceration, racial disparity, the treatment of juveniles, all of those things we have in Wisconsin. So we have to care, and we have to learn, and then we have to act. Now, there is a group here in Madison, an interfaith group called MOSES, and it's an acronym for Madison Organized for Solidarity, Equality, and Strength, I think. And it doesn't relate to the guy in Moses. It's just an acronym. And they're working very hard on these issues of mass incarceration, racial disparity. And part of their work focuses on the question of building a new Dane County jail. It's a very important question for us as a community. And it raises a whole lot of important public policy choices. The sheriff and jail, let me back up. Prisons in Wisconsin are run by the state. Jails are county institutions that are run by the sheriff. In Dane County, our current sheriff is a guy named Dave Mahoney. Dave Mahoney is a good, decent guy. He says, I need a new jail, and that's going to cost $130 million. I need a new jail because you keep sending me all these mentally ill people. And jail has become the default treatment center for mental illness. And if you're going to send me all these mentally ill people, you must let me treat them humanely. And I cannot do that in the current jail. So Dave Mahoney comes at this not from any kind of empire building, but from a very deep concern for the people that come through his jail. And what the community led by Moses has done is to kind of back that question up and say, what would happen if we didn't send you so many mentally ill people? How could we organize our community? How could we organize the system so that we didn't rely on the jail, but found a more humane, effective, and frankly, less expensive way of dealing with this problem? And that question has opened up a whole range of responses. And the county board has acted responsibly and set up study committees to try and look at each segment from the arrest. What's a police officer to do when he encounters a mentally ill person on State Street who is acting in threatening ways? What's that officer to do? He's got to remove the person from the situation. Where does he take him? And now he takes him to the jail. What if he could take him to some sort of triage center where they could sort through the process and see if there were resources that might better fit the guy's needs? So all those questions can be asked. Let me leave you with a hopeful note and a crazy idea, and then we can have plenty of questions. The hopeful note is that it doesn't have to be this way. Minnesota, which is very much like Wisconsin in terms of urban-rural populations, in terms of cultural traditions. I think we have more Catholics and they have more Lutherans, but they have only 1/3 as many people in prison as we do. And I don't know about you, but when I go to the Twin Cities or Rochester, I don't feel like I'm taking my life in my hands. I feel perfectly safe in Minnesota. So they have figured out a way to do public safety without mass incarceration. And the way they do that is providing much more treatment on the front end of the system. And the reason they do that is because of the way the money works. How many of you have worked for the state or for the county? Yeah, right. Me too. You'll understand this really important fact. In Wisconsin, if a county judge sends someone to prison, the state of Wisconsin pays the $30,000 to $50,000 a year to keep that person in prison. The judge imposes the sentence from which there is no relief, and the state pays. In Minnesota, if a county judge sentences someone to prison, the taxpayers of that county pay. So in Wisconsin, judges have an incentive to move the cost of prison to the state. In Minnesota, a judge has an incentive to save his or her taxpayers that money. So if they can send someone to a $10,000 a year drug treatment program instead of prison, they have saved their voters a pile of money. So there is this mechanism that explains why Minnesota effectively puts more money into treatment. So we can be Minnesota. It just requires us to change the way we think about prison. To begin to care about the people that are in prison. Like Ruth says, there are people. To understand the issues and to act. Now, let me leave you with my crazy idea. The reason why legislators and other public officials respond the way they do to crime, the reason we have mass incarceration is the politics of fear. People get elected these days by making other people afraid. And they tell you, you need to be afraid, and I will keep you safe, because I will lock up everybody and throw away the key. So if you care about your safety, if you care about your kids' safety, vote for me. And I think that the politics of fear affect every level of elected officials in Wisconsin. I think if you're running for school board these days, the way you try and get votes is to say, I think we need more metal detectors in schools, or I think teachers ought to have guns. Those are the kinds of arguments you make if you're running for school board. So the politics of fear is really, really powerful. And to change this system, we need to let people know we're not afraid, that we're not going to be manipulated that way. So here's my crazy idea, that someday we'll get 1,000 people to gather at the Mississippi River Bridge in La Crosse, okay? And we'll all walk, all 1,000 of us, we'll walk across that bridge. When we get to Minnesota, we'll say, hey, this is not so bad. This can work. So that's my crazy idea. And when I get it organized, I'll let Jonathan know. He can put it on your Facebook page, and you guys can all come and be part of that. So I'm done. But I'm happy to take questions, and I promised that I would stand right here and hang on to this lectern for dear life, and you can move the microphone around for questions.
I'm sorry. Good behavior and parole.
Yeah, right. That's a really good question that you finally got. That was terrific. Thank you. Yes, we are working on that, and Moses is an affiliate of a statewide group called Wisdom, and we have about 25 chapters around the state of all different kinds of faith communities, and we're having a big lobby day on next Tuesday at the Capitol. Go on the Wisdom website, WISDOM Wisconsin. You'll get all the information. Yeah, we're working on all of this to undo truth in sentencing, which is the policy that eliminated parole and time off for good behavior. To change that on its face is going to be very hard, because Scott Walker, when he was in the legislature, was the author of Truth in Sentencing. Okay. And we kind of have to wait, but we may be able to make changes, kind of undermine it from the bottom up. For example, there's an idea to maybe create make one of the prisons into a tech school, so that inmates would go there and actually be able to get certification and college credits from that tech school. And maybe if they complete that, they would get out early, which would be a change. That's a small thing, and you think that would be obvious, but it would move us away from the idea that people cannot change, which is what undermines truth and sentencing. Let me just say one thing I love about being a minister instead of a lawyer. When I was a lawyer, and I was part of these discussions, I would say things like, I think this truth in sentencing is bad public policy. I'm not sure we ought to do this. Now, since I'm an ordained minister, I can say this. Truth in sentencing is evil. It is evil. Every major religious tradition believes that people can change. As a Christian, that's pretty much fundamental to what I believe. And truth in sentencing denies that. It says if you're a 19-year-old kid and get sentenced to 20 years, we're going to keep you there because you're never going to change. There's no possibility that you will change. That is both crazy and evil. And evil is the word I get to use now. So.
I love the idea of getting treatment for like young black men in poverty. And I'm concerned that we not think that it's going to save us so much money immediately. I'm sure in the long run it definitely will. But I know a young man who I love, and I see him as a sweet young man, but I think he has an alcohol problem and he's a little bit mentally slow. So he got in trouble for what, I don't know exactly what. And he was in jail for a while, and then he was supposed to go and do alcohol treatment. And the alcohol treatment was provided, but he lives up off of Highway CV, north of the airport, and he had to walk down 2 miles of highway with no sidewalk in the winter where the snow piled up and cars going by to get to a bus to go down to South Madison to get his treatment. So he violated because he just didn't make it every day. He kind of like gave up a little bit, because at night you're walking along the highway and the snow is piled up. It's not fair. It's just not fair. Theoretically he got drug treatment, but he didn't really.
That's a really powerful story, and there's a lot to that story. Fundamentally, it ignores the difference between black lives and white lives and the resources people have and don't have. And it assumes that you can do this stuff. The way the system looks at that is, well, we could have sent him to prison. We didn't send him to prison. We gave him this drug treatment program without stopping to ask, can that work? Can he do that? And there's another part of all this, which is he may well have gotten that drug treatment as a condition of probation. And so if he violates that, he'll go to prison. He will not have committed a new crime, but he'll go to prison. And there are 4,000 people in Wisconsin every year that get sent back to prison for violating their rules. In Wisconsin, the way the sentence works is you're given a set time inside the walls that cannot be changed, and a set time outside the walls that cannot be changed. So you'll get a sentence of 40 years, 20 years in, and 20 years out. And when you're out, you'll have these rules that you have to follow on the outside. Sometimes those rules, you can have 70 rules that you have to follow. Some of them include things like not using a cell phone, or not using a computer, or not having liquor. And if you violate one of those rules, you can be sent back to prison to do the remainder of your time inside the walls. So 4,000 people a year get sent back for non-criminal rule violations. That cost us between $150 million and $200 million a year. In Minnesota, you only get sent back if you commit a new crime. Okay? And you're exactly right. I don't think we should cut prison costs so we have more money for roads. We need to cut prison costs so we take that money and put it into treatment. So, there you go. Thank you.
So thanks for your talk. I really appreciate it. But you talked a lot about sort of the advocacy side, but I'm wondering what your 50% of time in prison looks like.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. What we do a lot of, we do a small amount of Christian worship. And we do that in a very particular kind of way, because we were invited to come in and do these worship services by a chaplain who was very concerned that prisoners in her institution didn't have access to communion. That the worship services on Sunday are generally provided by outside churches who come in and do the worship service. And many of those traditions have limitations on who can take communion. Now, for example, in pretty straightforward Catholic services, if you're not a Catholic, you shouldn't come forward for the Mass. In some Lutheran traditions, it's the same way. In some evangelical or Pentecostal traditions, they don't want you to come forward unless you've been saved or born again. So she was concerned that there were barriers to people having access to the communion table. And she knew that in our tradition, we have an open table. Anyone can come forward. Because, not to get too theological about it, but Jesus ate with sinners, prostitutes, and thieves, and so if his table was open to everybody, our table should be open to everybody. So we have this tradition of an open table, and she invited us to come in to do an intentional service that would be open to anyone. And so we do that. We also do some meditation work that is mindfulness meditation. It's not any kind of Buddhist, or there's no theology in the meditation. It's simply mindfulness. And we do a lot of restorative justice work. We bring together victims, offenders, and the community inside the walls to talk about how we can heal the harm caused by crime. And I think that's a really important difference in the way the criminal justice system sees crime. In the criminal justice system, the only two questions are who committed the crime and how much time should they do. In restorative justice, the question is who was harmed and how can we repair that harm. And I believe deeply in restorative justice because I go back to an experience I had when I was in the DA's office. And it really was, it's become more and more important to me as I get more and more committed to restorative justice. When I was in the DA's office, You guys know the McDonald's down on Park Street, right? Two white guys from Fort Atkinson came up, and this will date the story, came up to TV Lenny's to buy a mattress. So they bought this mattress, and they had this little white pickup, and they put the mattress in the back of the truck, and then went around the corner to McDonald's. And they're in McDonald's, and a bunch of black kids from the neighborhood come in. And one of the black kids, named Ramondo Seymour, for some reason, had this 30-inch bow hunting arrow. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever gone bow hunting, but a bow hunting arrow comes to a point and has like 3 razor blades. And you use it for hunting deer. For some reason, he had this arrow. And he was waving it around and being crazy. And a fight breaks out between the 2 white guys and the black kids. And the N-word may have been used. And during the fight, Ramondo Seymour takes that arrow and stabs one of the white guys through the back and into the back of his heart. And he dies instantly. And, you know, if any of you have been to McDonald's when there's a spilled milkshake or something, the crew comes out with mops and starts. That's what they did to this crime scene. Anyway, the cops come. It doesn't take them long to find Ramondo Seymour. And the case ends up on my desk to prosecute Ramondo Seymour for murder. So it ends up we have a 3-day trial. And I remember very clearly how that courtroom looked. On the left side were the victim's family and all of his friends from Fort Atkinson. On the right side of the courtroom were just Ramondo Seymour's mother, grandmother, and grandfather. During those 3 days, I walked in and out of that courtroom and never spoke to any of those people. They had nothing to do with my case. They hadn't been there. They were not witnesses. They had nothing to say. My job as Deputy District Attorney for Dane County was to convict Ramondo Seymour of murder. And that was my exclusive focus. 30 years later, I was invited to come to Merritt Hospital to talk to a group of parents of murdered children. It's a support group for parents whose kids have been murdered. And they asked me to come and give the invocation for their Christmas gathering. And I said, sure, I'd be glad to come. And after I agreed, I thought, oh my God, what if that kid's parents are there? The people I ignored in that courtroom. What am I going to say to them? Because I'd come to realize that there was so much harm in that courtroom that I did not acknowledge. Not only the victim's family, but Ramondo Seymour's family. I mean, they were losing a son. And what about the community? What about South Madison? What about the people there that would give their kids $1 to go to McDonald's to get a Happy Meal? No, there was so much harm that I had not acknowledged. And so all I can think of to say to those parents is, I was wrong, and I understand things much differently now. And I'm really sorry for your loss. Fortunately, they weren't there. But that story still continues to inform my commitment to restorative justice. We just can't be custodians of a system that creates this kind of justice and, more importantly, ignores the harm. So, thanks.
Marty.
homelessness is a good example. You know, what percentage of people in Dane County Jail now are there for having missed a fine or having, you know, some infraction, something that certainly was not a victim situation, but just because they couldn't afford or didn't have the right resources to do what was needed to please the state of the county, whatever. What can the city of Madison do to provide, for example, housing for mentally ill, the kind of triage state that place that you were talking about? What can we do as citizens to incite this to happen?
Well, that's a terrific question, and kind of takes us back to over-reliance on mass incarceration. Mm-hmm. As long as we believe, as the governor believes, and I don't like to give Scott Walker credit for much, but I will give him credit for being sincere in his wrong-headed opinion about mass incarceration. He believes that mass incarceration is the way to keep Wisconsin safe. And as long as we rely on that model, then we'll never look honestly at the other problems like mental illness and homelessness that drive that system. So we have to change our perspective. And, you know, nobody understands homelessness and economic crimes better than Grace Church. I mean, you guys have had the homeless shelter forever, and I love you for it. And I used to work in the rain across the street when it was the Department of Justice. You know, now it's great. I mean, my old office, I think, is a condo that sells $500,000. I didn't know how lucky I was. But we used to, you know, we'd have a retirement party or something, have a cake left over, we'd bring it over to the shelter. So nobody understands those issues better than this congregation. But until we quit kidding ourselves about what the solution is and start looking at the real problems, we're going to get nowhere. Now, I will say this, that on some of those economic crimes, Sheriff Mahoney actually has some good ideas about that kind of stuff, because he desperately wants to get guys out of his jail. So they've been looking at things like, one issue is bail. If homeless people can't make bail, then they sit in jail, okay? And so is there a way that we can redefine how we think about bail? Or could they get, you know, short-term loans from some place like Madison Area Urban Ministry to make bail so they're not there? So Sheriff Mahoney and people in the system have been looking at that issue. But until we change our focus, it's going to be really hard.
I'm interested in the political process, and I think the only way that the political process is going to truly get engaged is that if a sufficient economic model can be put forward that truly lays out to some of these people who want to cut the cost of everything, that somehow this is in their collective best interest. And in the long term, if we deal with some of these issues the way they should be dealt with, that our costs are going to be lower. Can that economic argument be made in your mind?
That's the $1.4 billion question. That's how much we spend on prisons in Wisconsin every year. The Department of Corrections is the largest agency in state government. As far as I know, it's the only state agency whose budget was not cut this year. And there is such great logic in your argument that this cost us $1.4 billion, more money than the University of Wisconsin. Surely we can cut those costs. And you think they want to do it. They don't. They do not want to cut the cost of prisons. Grover Norquist, the anti-tax guy, the no new taxes guy, came here to Wisconsin last spring and talked to the Republicans and said, we have to change this. Mass incarceration is inhumane and expensive. This is Grover Norquist making this argument. They ignored him. They added, a couple of weeks after he spoke, they added another $5 million to the budget. And I think, let me give you kind of a two-pronged answer. One hopeful and the other not so hopeful. The hopeful answer is that Republicans may start to use that as a pretext for making some changes. So back to the question about how do you undo truth in sentencing. They may hang a good policy argument on that saving money argument. But the thing that's less hopeful is that I think in the current legislature, with the current governor, they really like to spend money on prisons. So if that is their highest priority, then that argument fails, you know. And I learned this during the economic downturn in 2008. Many of us working on prison reform thought, well, the silver lining in this is that they won't be able to spend as much on prison. They did, they spent the same amount. They love spending money on prisons. That is their highest priority. And they'll spend money on prisons and not on school and not on health care. Because they believe that it works. Not only that, they know that it got them elected. And that's the problem. So I think we need to continue to make that argument. But I think we're kidding ourselves if we don't recognize that this is what they really like to spend money. Yeah.
Would you say, inform us about the role of privatization in prisons?
Privatization, yeah, good quick, there are companies, publicly traded companies that you can buy stock in that run prisons around the country. They get contracts with states to run their prison system for profit. So the guards and staff inside the prisons are not state employees. They're employees of the Corrections Corporation of America. And the states do this on the idea that it will save money. And that's always the argument on privatization, that private companies can do it cheaper than the state, which raises, do you really want prisons run more cheaply? In Wisconsin, so far, privatization of prisons has not gotten a lot of support. It is one of the issues, I think, that ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the conservative group, pushes. But so far in Wisconsin, it has not gotten traction. In other states, the way it works, for example, in Mississippi, who has a contract with the Prison Corporation of America, they are guaranteed a certain number of inmates. As a minister, that is really discouraging to me. Because I would like to think that if I went down there and preached great sermons, that I could change things. And if people, started behaving better and didn't go, what would happen if things changed? Would they still, they'd just go on, they'd send Boss Hogg out to arrest people to fill that contract. So that's the way it works. And the Wall Street Journal, several years ago, had a list of 10 best buys. Where to put your money in the stock market. And Corrections Corporation of America was one of their 10 best. It's 10 or 8. Are we about done?
Yes, we are.
Okay.